I'm thrilled to see so many friends and colleagues and students here. Welcome to the Harvard Kennedy School Energy Policy Seminar. I'm Joe Aldy. I'll be hosting our seminar today. Thrilled to have a full room, even as we are moving into reading period and preparing for final exams here at the Harvard Kennedy School. Also excited that we have nearly 200 friends joining us online via Zoom. Today, the United States and allied nations have begun implementing what's become known as the Russian oil price cap. To help us better understand this issue, we're thrilled to have with us today Ben Harris and Catherine Wolfram. Dr. Harris is the Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy and a counselor to the Secretary of the Treasury. Prior to joining the Treasury Department, Harris was the Executive Director of the Kellogg Public-Private Initiative and a research associate professor at the Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management. Earlier in his career, he served as the chief economist and economic advisor to then Vice President Joe Biden, was the policy director of the Hamilton Project, a fellow in economic studies at the Brookings Institution, and deputy director of the Retirement Security Project. Professor Wolfram is a visiting professor here at the Harvard Kennedy School on leave from the Haas School of Business at the University of California, Berkeley. She recently left her position as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Climate and Energy at the Treasury Department. At Berkeley, Professor Wolfram is the Cora Flood Professor of Business Administration, and she served as the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at the Haas School. Before joining the Biden administration, Professor Wolfram was the Program Director at the National Bureau of Economic Research, Environment and Energy Economics Program. We'll open today's session with a presentation by Professor Wolfram, providing an explainer on the Russian oil price cap based on a policy brief that she and colleagues published today through both the HKS Belfer Center and the Mosavar Rahmani Center for Business and Government. I will then welcome Assistant Secretary Harris for a conversation before we take questions from our in-room audience. Professor Wolfram, welcome to the Kennedy School Seminar.
Thanks so much, Joe. I can't tell you how thrilled I am to be here today. It's a day that I have had on my radar for many months now. December 5th. December 5th marks the birth of a new policy, the price cap on Russian oil. So as Joe said, before I get into the price cap on Russian oil, just a bit about me. As Joe said, I'm a visiting professor here at the Kennedy School on leave from UC Berkeley. And until about 6 weeks ago, I was Ben's Deputy Assistant Secretary for Climate and Energy Economics. And it was the thrill and honor of a lifetime, really. I admire everyone in this room who is committed to a life in public policy. It was really, really fascinating. I was there for 20 months, but most of the last half of that, most of the last 10 months, I spent working on the price cap on Russian oil. So I will talk about that, but I do want to emphasize that I'm no longer at Treasury, so I do not speak on behalf of Treasury. Together, as Joe mentioned, together with Simon Johnson and Lukasz Rahel, we've published a policy brief on the Russian oil price cap. And really our target audience are the people in this room, students and professors who we hope will use it for class. Right now it's a draft, so I encourage you to take a look at it. I encourage you to give us feedback on what you think would be helpful to include that we haven't, what you think is not as understandable. Please give us that kind of feedback. But we really thought it would be useful to lay out the basic economics and logic behind the price cap. So what I want to do now quickly before turning it over to Joe and Ben is make 2 points. The first point is that in thinking about the price cap, it's really important to consider the alternatives. So I've read, there have been some critiques of the price cap out there, and I've looked at those. So some of them have said, it's going to be really hard to set the price. I think we proved that wrong. On Friday, there was a general agreement on the price of $60 a barrel. Or, Russia may be able to sell around it. That's kind of part of the mechanism. That's something that we anticipated. But often I get to the end of these critiques and think, well, some of your points might be valid, but what do you suggest as an alternative? It's like democracy. It may be that the worst outcome or the worst policy out there, the worst process out there, except when you consider all the alternatives. So I want to lay out two alternatives that I think are considerably worse than the price cap. The first alternative is an outright embargo or export ban. And historically, that has been the approach that we've taken to sanctioning countries that are major oil exporters. So that's been the approach with Iran, with Venezuela. And it's an embargo or an export ban that's enforced by something like UN sanctions or US secondary sanctions. But it's important to recognize that Russia is just fundamentally different from Iran and Venezuela. Iran accounted for at most about 2% of world oil exports. Russia accounts for almost 10%. So very rough calculations suggest that if we took half of Russia's oil exports off the market, that would spike oil prices by about 50% or more and would likely throw us into a global recession. So the EU six package, which they passed in early June and introduced at the beginning of May, was kind of a partial export ban. And how much oil it would have taken off the market was up to debate. Different analysts had different estimates of how much oil it would have taken off the market. But I think it helps us understand how the price cap works. So let me say a little bit about the EU six package. This was the policy that they introduced at the beginning of June. So it did two things. First of all, it banned imports of Russian oil to the EU, starting with crude today, petroleum products on February 5th. And the second thing it did is it banned EU companies from providing services like financing, like insurance, like trade credit, to the transport of Russian seaborne oil going anywhere. So it banned imports into imports into Europe, and then said, even if you're trying to redirect that oil, we don't want you to use European services. And it was likely that the UK and Norway would have adopted similar bans on services. And so if you account for the UK, Norway, EU, they provide about 90% of insurance, or at least 90% of insurance for Russian oil shipments. So it's really unclear kind of how you would have redirected the Russian oil that used to go to Europe to other parts of the world without providing these services. The estimates were that about 1 to 2 million barrels a day of oil would come off the market, potentially spiking prices again by say 20, 30%. So importantly, the price cap works as an exception to this six package. It's really a safety valve for the European process. So that companies based in the EU, based in the G7, are allowed to provide services, provide insurance, provide trade finance, as long as the transaction involves oil price below the cap. So I think that helps us avoid the extreme outcome where we're banning exports from Russia and taking a lot of oil off the market. Okay, so that's kind of one end of the spectrum, one bad alternative. I think at the other end of the spectrum, another bad alternative is to do absolutely nothing. So I find that untenable. John McCain put it pretty succinctly. He said, Russia is a gas station masquerading as a country. So in numbers, Russia, well over 50% of the Kremlin's revenues this year come from oil or natural gas exports. So it's really hard to think about doing anything to reduce Russia or doing much to reduce Russians' ability to wage the brutal, unprovoked war without doing something about oil. And so as I see it, these two extreme outcomes are really untenable, and doing something in the middle, like the price cap, is where we have to be. The second point I wanted to make is just to put the price cap in a bit of context. First of all, one thing that we really dive into in the policy brief is explaining how the price cap on Russian oil is different from the price caps that you learn about in Econ 101. And I encourage you to look at the policy brief for that. Importantly, it's not a price cap on the whole market. It's just on one supplier to the market. The second thing is that the price cap is novel. As my co-author Simon Johnson likes to say, we've now got the car on the road. It's got wheels. It's running. How fast it goes and how it's driven remains will be determined, and we will watch this intently with a lot of interest. But thank you so much. I look forward to your questions, and take care.
Catherine. So then if you want to join me. So as I see some of our students from the college here, I recall how when I was a freshman in college, one country invaded another. Iraq invaded Kuwait. We saw an effort through traditional levers of diplomacy, the State Department, the Secretary of State, the UN ambassador, trying to build a coalition to combat this. We learned the names of generals and the Secretary of Defense. We didn't hear so much from the Secretary of Treasury back then. We're now in the 21st century. We see this unprovoked aggression from Russia invading Ukraine. And what we've seen is I think, a change and sort of a increasing breadth of tools used to try to deter or punish such aggression. So to start with, Ben, it'd be great before we drill down into the price cap is to describe a little bit about the theory of the case for economic and financial tools as part of the administration's toolkit in trying to address the conflict in Ukraine.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks for having me here today. I mean, let me just start off by saying this is a monumental day for not just for U.S. sanctions policy, for G7 collaboration, but honestly for the people of Ukraine who have seen just a massive step forward on a global scale to limit Russia's resources to fight this war. Today is a huge day. We've been working around the clock, and I don't just mean the United States, and I don't just mean the Treasury Department, I mean the G7, around the clock for 8 months to get to this point today is just a big, big day. To answer your question, why are sanctions part of our response effort? And I think that Catherine laid it out well at the outset. For a country that relies on 50% of its revenue through a few commodities and uses that revenue to fight a war, if you want to put an end to the war faster, you've got to address the trade of those commodities. And B, if you want to deter future actions like this, which is undoubtedly an illegal war.
No. Yeah.
Like the opposite of a hot mic.
There we go.
Great.
Okay.
Oh, that's better. All right. Do I need to start all over from the beginning?
However you'd like. We do have several hundred people joining us online, so to the benefit, it might be useful.
Okay. So we started off by saying this is such a big day for the United States, for the G7, but in particular for the people of Ukraine who saw an unprecedented sanctions action come into effect after around-the-clock work by public servants around the world to implement this today. And you had asked, Joe, about why economic sanctions to end a war. There are a lot of tools, obviously, for ending a war, but in this particular circumstance where you had one country in Russia, as Catherine noted from the outset, relying on the trade of a few global commodities to bring in over half its revenue, and then to use that revenue to fight this war. Obviously, addressing the trade of those commodities was crucial, not just for ending the war faster, but for deterring future actions like this. This is so incredibly novel what the world has done today. I remember, hopefully I'm not embarrassing Catherine with this anecdote, but before she was considering coming to Treasury, and here you have this world-renowned academic, and we were trying to convince her, and she had reasonable questions about whether or not it would be how engaged would she be. If I had said to Catherine, you'll be a central intellectual force on ending a war in Europe, I mean, she would have thought I was crazy, but that's how much the world has changed in 8 months, where now, potentially being at a finance ministry means being part of ending wars. And so, I think I'll just end with this, which is I think what we proved today, and we'll see how this plays out over the next few months, was that the combination of creativity and collaboration can be really powerful. And we've never gotten here without both. And if the United States had elected to go alone with a price cap, it would have not made sense and would not have worked. And this required collaboration across all the G7 to get to where we are.
So let's talk a little bit about the G7. So first, why the G7? And could you describe a little bit about where you see the value in that kind of economic diplomacy and working through that institution, as opposed to doing it in an ad hoc way with individual countries or working through alternative institutions?
So, as Catherine noted at the outset, the standard way of doing sanctions in the past has been country X cannot trade good Y. And that could be problematic in some circumstances if country X could get around that sanction, or if the other side of that trade, the people and markets and countries that depend on receiving good Y, would be unduly harmed. That paradigm doesn't work. And so with the G7, you needed a suitably large coalition to put in place this type of sanction, which says, look, not only we're not saying don't trade good Y, we're saying please trade it, but just at a certain price. And that requires a global coalition of like-minded countries. That's kind of the big picture to 30,000-foot answer. The in the weeds answer is that the price cap was largely a tweak or amendment or response to the sixth sanctions package that EU put in place in June of 2022. So it undoubtedly had to include not just the G7, but the EU. And this is the EU plus the G7 plus Australia, if we want to be precise. It's important that we had to include the EU. And once you're including the EU in this particular circumstance with an oil trade where there's a lot of integration between the UK and the EU, so for example, the relationship between UK P&I clubs or those that are providing insurance on the ships and the reinsurers who are housed in other in European countries, it had to include the UK also. But it really made sense to be a G7 coalition, just given the like-minded nature of those countries.
So since you got in the weeds a little bit there, tell us a little bit about the process. How is it? I mean, there are probably, I'm sure, a lot of late night calls, early morning calls. You're navigating time zones, but you're also doing a lot of back and forth to try to build a coalition around an idea that, as you noted and Catherine noted, is novel. We don't really have I think, an obvious historical analog to this. It's not like if we just pick this policy tool off the shelf and say, okay, here's an application for it. You had to develop the idea, but then you also had to sort of build trust among these partners of the idea. So if you could describe a little bit about the nature of that process for you dealing with your counterparts, how Secretary Yellen engaged other finance ministers on it. How did you help sort of build the comfort and the trust so this is something that could be implemented in practice in the markets?
Yeah, so I know nothing about diplomacy. My current and former boss, Joe Biden, knows a lot about diplomacy. And when I was his chief economist and he was the vice president, he would say things along the lines, I'm sort of paraphrasing, but all diplomacy is about relationships. And that has certainly proven to be true in my experience over the past 8 or 9 months, where the various entities putting in place sanctions hadn't had this type of collaboration before. So we all had to get to know each other. And I'm really stepping on OFAC's turf right now at Treasury. So take this with a grain of salt. But it's my understanding that those relationships had not been built before. And what we had to do is we had to have a cohesive set of regulations. It was to be led by the EU, but we needed to have a cohesive, consistent set of regulations. Otherwise, it would have been impractical for industry to comply. We'll get to that in a second. But that meant more international travel than I've ever done in my life. It meant lots of international travel for our counterparts, because for a lot of these cases, Zoom wasn't enough. We had to actually go to these countries, sit down with them, meet, and get to know them. And it got to the point where, after sort of months of Zoom, and we now are flying across oceans to meet each other. I mean, you literally see sort of this, sometimes they're just be embracing and hugging amongst these colleagues because we spent so many hours getting to know and to trust one another. And so when you hear statements coming out of political appointees that sort of weigh in on the collaborative nature of the G7, this is what we're talking about, because this required outstanding trust to get to where we're getting to. And a lot of times this means sitting down with someone face to face in their home country and having that conversation. So this was, what's the phrase? Like it took a lot of, frequent flyer miles to get to this place.
So you mentioned the need to get industry to comply with this. There's some parts of this market, like if I want to know the price of gasoline, I can drive around the corner, I can see it posted. I could go to Ron Klain's Twitter account, like I could know the price of gasoline that way. But understanding the price of crude oil being sold from one country to some counterparty is much less transparent in this market. So if we're going to be imposing a cap on the price of oil, how do you think about designing something that could actually work in practice? Not like what some academic might come up with and then in the ivory tower and say, well, I'm just going to assume enforcement and assume compliance. You have to design something that would work in practice. So how do you think about the way this is designed that would both facilitate easy compliance, but also provide the means for you to be able to see, to monitor, to collect the necessary information to see if the key private sector players are complying with the policy?
Yeah, so prices and Russian oil trading, or price transparency and Russian oil trading don't really go hand in hand. You might think that given all the effort that goes into monitoring the trade, that one would know the price with great specificity. These are not hundreds of tankers leaving Russia every day. There's a handful every week. But there is, this is a kind of an opaque market. And so you can log on to Bloomberg and say what the price of Urals is trading for, but there's a lot of guesswork that goes into that. And there's a lot of uncertainty. And actually, it's interesting, when you think about the people who report on the price of Russian oil, they actually call themselves journalists. There's no other example, like people who report on the price of gas or eggs, they don't call themselves journalists. You can just go look at the price. But these industries actually have to go and make phone calls and dig. And so it's fairly opaque. But that being said, your question was about how to make this easy for industry. Again, going back, we want there to be trade of Russian oil insofar as it's below the price cap. And so we had to not only just sort of dictate the terms to industry, we had to work with industry and put in place a scheme that would work for all these various service providers along the way, whether we're talking about shippers or insurance providers or the brokers or the banks providing the finance. And so we developed this with them. We went to them, we said, what would work for you? How could you possibly comply with this? And so we got to what's called an attestation and record keeping model. And basically, we're not asking these service providers to go ahead and submit their receipts to some central repository. The idea is, and it depends a bit on the nature of the business of the service provider, but in general, they need to either keep their receipts, put it in a desk drawer and keep it for a period, or they need to go ahead if they don't know the price that's being traded. So for example, if you're an insurer, you typically don't know the price on each tanker that's leaving some Russian port. You need to get an attestation from another service provider. And that's why we describe this as basically a safe harbor. And the safe harbor is for those service providers that in good faith go out and try to get the information they need to comply with the price cap. And we've reiterated this time and again with the private sector, which is all about the good faith. It's all about the intention. And if you do make that good faith effort, you'll get the safe harbor. But the overriding point is this was created in consultation with the private sector because we do want them to participate.
Now, one thing that we've seen how oil markets have changed over the last several decades is the tremendous growth in demand by emerging economies. So we have a number of major countries that are not members of the G7, they're not Australia, who are big consumers of oil now. So we think about China, India, et cetera. How is the design of this, where you're focusing on suppliers and implementing this price cap? How does that influence the incentives for how these big countries, how some of the companies in those big countries will be buying crude oil for refining? Describe a little bit about the incentives they face for effectively complying with the price cap, even if they are not publicly saying we are a member of this coalition.
So if you want to understand the price cap, you have to understand the 6 sanctions package. If you want to understand the 6 sanctions package, you have to understand how oil is traded. Oil is traded using oftentimes, so 90%, for example, of insurance is sold through Western insurance providers. It's sold using Western services. So you could have an Indian refiner purchase oil from Western Siberia, but the oil is often carried on, say, a Greek tanker using UK insurance and some other Western bank, right? So if not for that characteristic, this would probably be much harder to put in place. That's the first thing. The sixth sanctions package did two things. One, it banned European import of seaborne Russian oil, which was, a big deal, but not a huge deal, because they could just go ahead and get, Middle Eastern oil or get it from other places, and then, it'd just be this big shakeup and redirection, and maybe it'd be a bit more expensive because shipping costs go up. But that really wasn't the meat of the sixth sanctions package. The meat of the sixth sanctions package was saying these insurers or these shippers, well, shippers were not included in the sixth sanctions package, they're added later, but these service providers cannot be used in the trade of Russian oil. And that's why you can't get trade from Russia to India or to Indonesia or somewhere else. And so the key part about this is that we did not need the purchasers to be part of the coalition. There was about a 2-month period where you'd see all these reports saying, well, India is not going to join the coalition, it's going to fail. I think that misunderstood what we were trying to do. We were trying to build a coalition of service providers that would provide a release valve for the trade of Russian oil that was beneath the cap. Now, what does this mean for China and India and other purchasers of Russian oil? We're basically providing them leverage. And so we get the question all the time, won't this help India? Won't this help China? Yes, this helps everyone but Russia. I mean, let's be clear about what this is. This is basically a transfer to any purchaser of oil at the expense of Moscow. And so we were incredibly encouraged over the past 3 or 4 months to hear reports that the Russians were running around the world desperately trying to lock in 30% discounts off of Brent with these long-term contracts. Now, if I had told you prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine that Moscow was just desperate to get a 30% discount off of Brent, you would have thought I was crazy. These usually traded at almost exactly the same level, maybe a slight discount for euros off of Brent. But all of a sudden, they're just begging for a 30% discount. That was before the price cap was put in place. And that shows the power of the price cap in providing leverage to purchasers of Russian oil to negotiate lower prices. So, another question we get, now I'm like basically interviewing myself, but another question we get is, well, what would happen if there was no Russian oil sold beneath the price cap? Wouldn't that be a failure? No. If the price is 60, and let's say Brent's 100, and there's a lot of journalists, I'm not predicting the price of Brent, but let's just say for argument's sake that Brent goes up to 100 and the price cap is at 60 and the Chinese and the Indians come in and buy at 62, and we've got this 40% discount off of Brent. That's a huge success. That's $40 that Russia's not collecting, and the price cap will be a success even though no oil is sold beneath the price cap. So just to kind of summarize, this is a coalition of service providers, but it is providing leverages to the purchasers of Russian oil.
Do you have more questions for yourself?
Yeah, just happened.
So I want to get to price cap and I want to get to success. But first on the price cap, why $60? What sort of helps explain how that was agreed to? But also curious, at what point in the future, under what conditions would you consider saying to your partners, we need to adjust this price cap?
So Europe set the price. That's a great question for the European Commission. I will say that for us in the U.S. Treasury Department and across the U.S. government, we try to triangulate on a few different data points. So one was the marginal cost of production. Get that in a second. The second was the historical price of Russian oil, and the third was the market price. And so with the marginal cost of production, there's a lot of disagreement about this. Our view was that we should provide the economic incentives for Russia to continue producing, because the goal here was not just to cut off Russian revenue, it was to cut off Russian revenue while preserving the flow of barrels on the market. And if you want to get to that second goal, you've got to provide an economic incentive to do so. So if you think about the distribution of the marginal cost of production, we wanted to be on the more expensive side of that. So sometimes it costs in a certain low quality wells a certain price, and then it gets a little bit more expensive another. We wanted to sort of have an all-in marginal cost production distribution across all wells, and we wanted to be on the right side of that, the more expensive side of that. So that would include costs like new drilling and new exploration. It would include perhaps internal transportation costs within Russia. Basically, if they were going to lose money on the production of a barrel, we didn't want to have that be one of the circumstances. Secondly, the historic price. So Russia was in the 5 years prior to their invasion of Ukraine, they're making the high 60s on each barrel sold. We didn't want them to be able to drive up the price of oil and then to benefit from it. This is kind of like a tire company scattering nails on a highway and then being there at the end to say, would you like your tire fixed, and profiting from an illegal action. So we wanted to look at the historical price and say, look, Russia's not going to benefit from driving up the cost more. And then, of course, we wanted it to be, around or below the market price of Urals. Now, these are three really different prices, depending on where the third one is. That was our own view, but ultimately, we wanted to get to any price that was acceptable across the G7, because think about what has happened now. We have $60 as a ceiling. And if the price of Brent goes up to 95, last time I checked right before this was at 85, it goes up by $10, comes down by $10, it's still above that ceiling, but now we have all the capacity in the world to adjust that price. And so essentially we're in control now.
What does success look like for this policy?
So we've already had success. We've already had success in maintaining this kind of fantastic spread between Urals and Brent. But success looks like continuing to drive down Russian revenue. So their budget situation is gone. They used to have about a $10 billion surplus at the beginning part of the war annually, and now it's a deficit that's 5 times that. So maintaining the fiscal pressure on Russia is certainly a big part of the success. Maintaining market stability, so continuing to see the flow of barrels out of Russia is a big part of that. But ultimately, this is part of a larger suite of options. Getting Russia out of Ukraine is really the North Star here.
Thanks. So I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'll invite Catherine Wolfram to join us and open it up for questions from our audience here in the room. So the last question is sort of thinking sort of big picture and longer term. So we've got this crisis in dealing with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the pressure it puts on our partners in Europe when they think about, can they keep the lights on? Can they keep homes heated through the winter? We're concerned about what kind of impact it has here in the US of higher energy prices as well. But this is all in the context of sort of longer term objectives, and certainly objectives of the Biden administration to decarbonize our energy system. And we saw, of course, significant legislative success this summer in trying to develop those policies going forward. So when you think about this sort of the near term challenge here, what are some of the lessons, whether they're political, economic, diplomatic, that help inform how we're going to tackle climate change, but also how we think about more generally how we engage our partners around the world economically, diplomatically, thinking through the geopolitics? Any sort of big lessons you draw from this as we transition from the near-term crisis to the longer-term challenges?
Yeah, it's a great question, Joe. So 2 parts to this. We, the Biden administration, over the past year, have passed 3 historic pieces of legislation that collectively, in our view, set the stage for economic growth going forward decades. So the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, and then the infrastructure bill. When you look at those collectively, it's just a massive piece of bill that just lays out the framework for long-term economic growth. But a lot of the benefits of those bills won't be felt for years or decades. Now, some hit right away. So, for example, what we're doing on charging stations or on broadband, the tax credits, which will come into effect almost immediately. That's immediate. That's a 2022, 2023 story. But some of it you won't be felt for decades. So I think we also needed a short-term strategy. And we've tried to be look, you can accuse us of being a lot of things, but you can't accuse us of being uncreative. So, the SPR, through the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, we've released more oil through the SPR in the past year than we have in the history of the United States. The price cap, again, Catherine said it, but this is an incredibly novel policy. And so we've had to sort of fill in the gaps until this long-term economic growth plan can come into effect. That's the big question. The second tiny little part before we get to the Q&A is that there were also some major global stability concerns. We didn't talk about that here, but the US is not buying Russian oil. We made that clear. As of today, the G7 is not buying crude. The beneficiaries of this were often low and middle income countries that have gotten slammed by the war, they've gotten slammed by higher energy and higher food prices. Not only will they be able to buy cheap Russian oil directly, but they'll have less volatility in the markets, which benefits everyone. So I think that by thinking about the beneficiaries beyond our own borders, just enable us to build coalitions a little better.
Let me follow up on one more thing here before I invite Catherine up. So we have, as you noted, the use of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. You have this effort as basically a club of buyers to limit the price of crude oil from one major supplier. There's another group of major suppliers called OPEC who are probably taking a look at this. How do you think about how they are reacting to this? How do you think about, there's a lot of diplomacy that goes on between the United States and members of OPEC. So how should we think about sort of their response and their the relationship we have with them going forward as a part of this?
So I'm an economist who's focused most of my career on public finance. And so I get really nervous when I ask about anything beyond US borders, and I get really nervous when I get asked about OPEC. That's generally the purview of the State Department and the White House. But I will say we've tried to clarify a few things. We're talking about the price cap. This is not a buyer's cartel. This is a sanction regime directed at Russia. So this is not meant to be oil from other sources. This is strictly about Russian oil. This is also not necessarily meant to be a regime to last, for centuries. This is meant to address the illegal war in Ukraine. So let's be clear about the scope about this. This is not about a global buyer's cartel for all oil. This is about oil that is coming out of Russian soil and nothing else.
Thank you. Catherine, if you can join us, please. We'll now open it up for questions from the audience. I'll note that what we'd like for you to do is raise your hand. I'll call on you. I'd like you to identify yourself, ask your question. A question is both short and ends with a question mark. I will repeat it for our audience on Zoom and then ask Ben or Catherine, whoever the question is intended for, to address the question. So, Professor Frankel.
Thank you. Jeff Frankel, Kennedy School. I've been very impressed with the sanctions from day one through today, the degree of cooperation and the strength of the sanctions. Given that, I would have expected as an economist that the ruble be worth less today than it was worth before these days. It was more than it was. And of the various explanations for that, I think the leading one is because they've got so much more oil revenue. So, has there been any reaction from the market?
So Professor Frankel asked about the strength of the ruble, noting that despite economic and financial sanctions since the beginning of the war, the ruble today is worth more than it was at the beginning of the war, and whether that should cause us to have some skepticism about the efficacy of some of these interventions. Is that a fair representation of the question? Okay.
So if I was going to make a list of things I didn't want to answer, courtesy questions might be right above OPEC. But since I'm from DC, I'm just going to answer the question I want rather than one that was asked. And so I'll defer to people who are no longer affiliated with the Treasury Department if they want to answer. But I will say, don't mistake trends in the ruble for trends in the Russian economy. The Russian economy is undoubtedly in deterioration right now. They're in recession currently. They will be in recession next year. They'll have major growth challenges for the near term, and really I think until they pull out of Ukraine. They're having a hard time getting capital goods. They're seeing massive human capital flight, massive financial capital flight. And so my only point here is whatever trends you're seeing in the ruble, don't mistake that for the strength of the Russian economy, because it is very, very weak.
I'll just add one thing. Watching oil markets over this period, I wouldn't, it's very hard to do an event study or like to see a reaction to policy announcements when it's such a novel policy and people don't know how it's going to play out or if it's going to be adopted until Friday. So I wouldn't read anything into the fact that there hasn't been a ruble reaction. I think the market is still trying to digest and trying to figure out where things are going.
Thanks.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts. So my question is that one school of thought was that by putting an embargo on Russian oil, it will accelerate the alternate sources of energy, the renewable sources. But now that you're keeping the Russian oil flowing, would it de-accelerate the development of alternate sources?
So the question is the potential influence that policy with respect to Russian oil could have on incentives for decarbonization and switching away from fossil fuels, and a concern that by keeping the barrels on the market in the short term, it may mute some of those incentives for decarbonization.
So I think from an economic perspective, we've been in a very fragile recovery coming out of the pandemic. I think we're, obviously quite happy with the strength of the U.S. economy. If you ask me to list the major risks to U.S. economy, I think that energy volatility would be pretty high up there. And so the fact that we're able to pass the Inflation Reduction Act and put in place hundreds of billions of dollars for incentives for renewable energy, along with many other things, which I won't go into here, I don't think is necessarily in conflict with trying to maintain short-term energy stability. And ultimately, I think the pain of seeing, I think it was JP Morgan who predicted $200 a barrel price for Russian crude. The pain associated with that type of spike. I'm not endorsing JP Morgan, but with that type of disruption, would certainly not be worth any of the potential gains. Kind of to the answer to your question earlier, Joe, I think we see this as really a two-step journey to more sustainable energy markets. And I think we've put the long-term part in with the legislation that's been passed, and now we're just trying to manage the stability in the short term.
I guess I would just emphasize, well, I should probably give the same caveat that Ben did, that I'm an economist. I've observed foreign diplomacy and realized that I'm really not a foreign diplomat. I haven't seen it up close. But think about what's happened over the past couple of months, that a bunch of people from G7 countries, from the European Union, have gotten together to talk about energy and to talk about how they want to consume energy. And so, I see that as kind of laying the groundwork for future conversations that have a lot to do with climate change. And that is me as a person kind of projecting that, but I think these are important relationships that have been formed and could potentially do a lot about climate change in the future.
Thank you. Yes. So the question is about some of the operational details of the price cap and trying to think about both the time horizon over which it would operate and whether there might be opportunities for those service providers outside of the coalition countries to undertake actions that might weaken the efficacy of the instrument.
Yes, this is a great question. And it's a great question because the operational details are really important to how this works. As far as the timeline, so December 5th, and these dates were put in place by Europe's sixth sanctions package. December 5th was the day by which we had to get a cap on crude oil. We have 60 more days from today to put a cap on refined product. The way that we have institutionalized this cap is there's going to be a cap on high value refined product, and then another separate cap on lower value refined product. How long these will be in place is entirely up to the discretion of the coalition, the EU, and the rest of the G7. So that's kind of the timeline question. As far as, are we worried that basically that there'll be the analogy of a shadow fleet for services? And one thing that has struck me throughout this whole process has been the certainty with which we have been advised in an uncertain situation. So there were those who were certain that Russia would shut in oil in advance of the US election. There are banknotes on this that treat this like, 100%, this is definitely happening. There was certainty that there will be very precise levels of shadow fleets created to transport refined product and crude oil. There is certainty that, oh, no, country X, Y, or Z will set up this massive insurance scheme overnight that will ensure the world's fleet. So I think we have come to this with some humility as far as projecting exactly what would happen. I think it's clear that there will be service providers that are either have already been created or will be created to help trade around the price cap. But again, we are fine with that. It is not evasion to use non-Western services to trade above the price cap. Now, Western services are often superior to non-Western services, A. B, many of the purchasers now are much further away, particularly when you look at the routes tankers have to take. So you're looking at a month or more to get to some of the refineries that are non-Western purchasers, rather than just Rotterdam or wherever that was much closer. So just because there may be some purchasers of non-Western services doesn't mean that it's going to be the same type of service. Sometimes it's lower quality or it's a longer route. But yeah, there will be a fair amount of we call subversion. But like I said, we're okay with that, and we're just hoping that we've provided some of the purchasers of Russian oil some more leverage.
Thank you. Ted Truman, senior fellow at the Center for. I'm also a Treasury alumnus, and I can say that Jim Baker would say that he had quite a lot to do with the Gulf War. And I would say that said this implicitly. The fact that you used 57, it was there, and therefore it could be used. So maybe you didn't have a lot of contact with 57, but a lot of your colleagues were able to build up a foundation, which says something for institutions like that. My question is, what would you think about what I think Catherine Wolfram said? What would be failure? We know what would be success, right? One question is how long, right? Most folks have to be. What would be failure? What would you count as failure?
So the question is, if we've talked about success, what success would look like with the Russian oil price cap, what might be potential evidence that it's not working, that it's a failure?
I mean, I think as Ben said, we're already seeing this giving countries leverage. We're already seeing it put downward pressure on the prices that Russia could get. But I think if that leverage went away somehow, I'm not sure how it would, but if every trade of Russian oil were whatever 15-20% above the price cap, and they were using Western services, I think like kind of broad scale evasion. But yeah, I mean,
let me make 2 points. One, you brought up institutions. And that's a really important part of this that I didn't mention, which was this never would have worked without the credibility of OFAC at Treasury and without the credibility of our partners. That was key to this. So when we go to service providers and we said, we want this to work with your cooperation, they actually believed us. That was really important. I think it's a great point. Secondly, without necessarily speculating on what failure looks like, I will talk about evaluating failure is not, and we had to make the point time and time again, it is not evaluating December 6th relative to December 4th. So that is, you cannot evaluate the price cap with respect to a baseline that looks like the way that oil's been traded. You have to look at it relative to a post-6 sanctions package where the EU has already banned all Western services. It's really important for getting the right baseline when you're evaluating success or failure. And I think that once we helped communicate that, that made paving the way for the price cap much easier.
Chris.
Chris Middle, so I want to start by saying I'm excited about this policy. But one close cousin to this policy, would have been to actually apply tax, the Russian tax, the Russian oil. Now, what that would have done is it would have generated a lot of revenue in Ukraine. Current system has been mentioned is the red privilege. Just one consider the tax on that. And second follow-up question: if this is wildly successful, a price cap on.
Okay, thanks, Chris. So the question is, why not a tax or a tariff on Russian oil? And as a follow-up, if this is successful, will we see a similar policy applied to natural gas?
So a discussion right now that the policies are around refined product and crude. That's the answer to your second question. As far as the question about tariff goes, for those who are steeped in economic theory, this is precisely the right question to ask, which is, won't you have an allocation problem if you're basically putting a ceiling on a certain price, right? And so, you think about this in the context of, I don't know, like, rent ceilings and things like that. And we did think about that. We wondered what would happen if so many purchasers of Russian oil were then lined up at the door to get this ultra cheap oil. How will we possibly allocate that? I mean, the answer is that in practice, when you have rising energy costs, it's really hard to advocate for a substantial tariff on those. It's hard to, I mean, from an economic theory perspective, it's a completely justifiable question. But in practice, and from a political standpoint, that would have been a bit of a challenge. And I think that over time, we worried a little bit less about the allocation problem because we realized there would be a fair amount of trade outside the price cap, A. And B, if we found ourselves in a situation where there was so much trade inside the price cap, we had to worry about how to allocate it. What a wonderful problem to have. So I think it's a really astute question, but ultimately for political and practical reasons, we opted to go with the cap.
Yeah, I guess I would just add, I mean, I was definitely a fan of the tariff early on in the discussions, but have come to realize that the price cap has certain advantages that the tariff doesn't. So think about the government of India. If you institute a tariff, the government of India has to formally vote through, take a policy stand and implement a tariff in order to be a participant in this. With the price cap, and the government of India has complicated relationships with the G7 and Russia, and probably does not want to sacrifice their relationship with Russia by doing that, especially ahead of time, by voting. I mean, India buys a lot of.
No, I said tax, not tax. Not.
Sorry, I said tariff.
So yeah, so we also thought about that, putting a big tax on the services. I mean, one of the problems there is you're trying to get the services to participate in the trade of Russian oil, and then you're saying you're going to slap a huge tax on that. I think we just worried that wouldn't happen. There was also the European Union, and this is out in the public sphere, that the European Union does not like secondary sanctions. They don't like doing things that influence other countries. And so, I mean, that limited the sets of things that we could consider.
Thank you. Gib.
Give that cap talks. Actually, about this idea we stick with that. Assuming enforcement works, I think that's see how that develops. Is this a one-off kind of policy that only works for
So Gibbs' question is whether this is a one-off for the current environment we're in right now, or could we think about this as an instrument that could be applied in other contexts for other commodities down the line?
So this only worked because of the particulars of the Russian oil trade and the high levels of dependence on Western services. If not for that, I don't think we would have had the leverage to put this in place. I think the takeaway maybe, I think the takeaway is that collaboration and creativity can be part of ways to address this type of aggression we've seen. I don't know if I want to go so far as to say we'll use this again with commodities or not. I really don't know. It depends on the country that's undertaking the aggression, and hopefully we won't see that, and this will usher in a new period of stability. So I don't think I want to go so far to say, yes, we now have this new tool we're going to use for the commodities trade. But I think we do have a sense of optimism and enthusiasm and momentum around using the economic power of the G7. And maybe I'm getting way out of my skis as like a lowly assistant secretary on this one. But I am encouraged by the optimism and the success coming out of the G7 to be creative in addressing these type of things. I will say too, just to digress for a bit, I mean, you don't get terribly emotional when you're talking about economics, but looking at the resolve, sorry. And my boss is Janet Yellen, who'd probably yell, but the resolve of the Europeans on this has been remarkable. I mean, given where they're at with energy security, to look in the face of Russia, a major supplier of their energy supplies, and say, we're going to prioritize this unproven regime, given the potential disruptions coming down the pike, is remarkable. I mean, I am just like proud to be, a colleague of theirs, if I can call it that. The resolve has been beyond impressive, and I think that resolve will carry through into future circumstances.
I would just add one. So this has made me appreciate the power of like institutions and the rule of law. So, think about Russian insurance. That's one thing that's been proposed as an alternative service provider, that Russia would provide the insurance. Is Russia really going to pay out if there's an oil spill? But with that's why we value G7 services so much, because that the insurance providers will pay out. So yeah, I don't want to speculate, or I don't know, I could probably speculate a little more Philippe than Ben, but it does make you realize, and probably in other markets, how valuable kind of institutions and economic trade based on those strong institutions, how valuable that is.
Thank you. We have a few more minutes before we need to wrap, and I apologize. We will need to wrap a couple minutes early. Ben has a 1:15 with 3 members of the cabinet. This is the problem about being in a world of Zoom now. You think you get out of Washington, but Washington can call you back. So here first, please.
Craig Kennedy's Data Center. I wanted to come back with a question about monitoring. You've laid out this process of attestation, which encourages participation by service providers, because it provides very specific diligence they have to undertake. A piece of paper put it before the pod, provides safety. But ultimately, that piece of paper provides prices provided by probably a Russian trader who is selling to a non-G7 buyer. And so it really is only as good as the veracity of that price reported onto the service chain. So is there going to be a audit process or online pullback, or if we suspect something like this and surprising Russian oil trade, how do you go about investigating? What sort of
So the question is about whether there will be opportunities for ensuring the enforcement, whether it's through auditing, whistleblowing, some kind of mechanism by which we have greater transparency, that the information being shared with those who have the attestation requirement under the Russian oil price cap, whether there's actually any value in that information.
And so I will do my best to channel OFAC and stipulate, take this with a huge grain of salt. But so I think the way that OFAC would answer this, I think, is that it doesn't rely on Russian traders. It relies, so there are 3 tiers. And the service providers are generally distributed into one of these 3 tiers. Tier 1 are those service providers who, over the normal course of business, perhaps like brokers who definitely know the price as part of the way that they conduct their trades. Tier 2 are those that sometimes know the price and sometimes don't. And tier 3 are those that usually don't know the price. The idea is that for tier 2 or tier 3, that they'll have to either ask the tier 1s who do know the price or the purchaser of the Russian oil who also knows the price. And that will suffice as an adequate attestation. So the idea is not necessarily to go to the Russians and say, what are you selling this for? Because, take what I say with a little grain of salt and take what, a Russian trader says with a huge grain of salt. But I don't think that they're relying on the accurate information of Russian industry as part of the attestation process.
Henry.
Yeah. What do you expect in the conversation about this? The Russians do what?
So the question is, what do you expect the Russians to do?
So the way that we have thought about this is that there is some uncertainty. Again, we're not talking about one product. We're talking about a handful of products, which we've grouped into 3 different buckets, but there's actually more than that. What has given us great comfort is that whatever Russia does, there are no good options. We've put them in a bit of a box here, where they can make decisions about supply, but remember that they're not exporting to the G7 anymore. So any supply disruptions will directly hurt those partners, which Russia is, I think, less eager to cause supply disruptions to. This is not the G7. This is not gas flowing to Italy. This is oil flowing to China and other low-income countries. So any supply disruption not only hurts their partners, but also really hurts their pocketbooks. And this is, as Catherine laid out the get, this is about half of their revenue, and this is an economy in rapid decline. They don't have great options. So, what precisely will Russia do? They made a lot of promises. Russia also said they wouldn't invade Ukraine. So let's take any statements coming out of Russia with the appropriate caution. Look, I can entertain different projections as far as what Russia will do, but I can't entertain the notion that whatever choice they make will ultimately lead them in a good spot, because that's not accurate.
Let me go with Steve with our last question.
I would very much like to see this work. I have more questions about one would sort of wonder if the reason that the service providers would agree to this. If we're putting the burden of this work on the company, one could expect that for all of this scale of how big the damage is potentially doing to Russia, also how big the prize is. I guess I'm looking for what is the counterbalancing resources dedicated to enforcement of this scale of
So Steve's question is about where do we see the resources to have sufficient or adequate enforcement to really try to minimize those who might try to evade this policy.
So OFAC's resources are fairly vast. We have hundreds of people devoted to this, and they're incredibly experienced. That's on the US side. One of the things that has given us a little more optimism around this has been the aligned incentives for everyone but Russia. So the purchasers want low prices. The service providers want volume because that's generally how they make money. But they make money, if you're a tanker, you make money whether it's trading at 60 or 80 or 100. The G7, kind of the implementers of this scheme, want the flow to continue and want it to be at low prices. So you have these aligned incentives across everyone but Russia. Here you kind of have like well, I'll just sort of leave it at that. And I think that, we have been encouraged by some of the responses coming out of purchasers. I don't want to say anyone's committed to being part of the price cap or not. But I do think that we, from the get-go, our theory of the case was that there'd be aligned incentives across the supply chain. And I haven't heard any information to contradict that. So I think that it's a perfectly reasonable question to ask about enforcement. But remember, this is really a partnership across the G7 industry who helped us design it. And what we're doing is driving down the price of oil, which ultimately benefits the purchasers. So it's like a joke that everyone's in on, except for Russia. And I hope that's not the line that comes out of this, but it might be. But that gives us I think, a little more optimism that we're going to be able to pull this off.
So before we wrap, let me note that this is the last seminar of the semester. Thanks to everybody for joining us throughout the semester, both here and on Zoom. I'd like to thank the Environment and Natural Resources Program at the Belfer Center, the Mosavara Rahmani Center for Business and Government, and the Harvard University Center for the Environment for their support of the seminar series. In particular, I want to thank Liz Hanlon, Paul Sherman, Amanda Sardonis for making everything behind the scenes go so smoothly. And finally, please join me in thanking Ben Harris and Catherine Wolfram for joining us today.